Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Can You Hear Me podcast. This is a podcast about news of the day and the communications implications that they present. My name is Rob Johnson. I'm a former Chicago TV news anchor and current president of Rob Johnson Communications, a communications consulting firm.
And I'm Eileen Rochford, a 25-year veteran of marketing communications and strategy, and I'm the CEO of the Harbinger Group, a communications firm here in Chicago.
So, the reason we wanted to do this is because we wanted to talk about what communications experts need to be thinking about, what you need to be thinking about, not only as an employee, but as an employer. And today's topic, our first topic in this podcast series, is best communication practices during and after the pandemic. So, we're going to talk about things like how employees were engaged during this unprecedented time working remotely. We're going to talk about the trust in employees. We're also going to talk about some of the current events going on now. The vaccines are starting to take hold. People are starting to think about how they're going to return to their office. And we also want to highlight some of the companies and what they're doing, what think the best practices are. But we also want to discuss in this time the tensions between employees and employers about the various visions for the return to office scenarios. That's what we're going to talk about today. And Eileen, I think that as a business owner, as somebody that employs people, you have some great insight to give us. Why don't we back up and talk about, just to get into this, just to give context to it. Let's back up about a year and talk about what it was like when everybody, not only for your office, but other offices where people all of a sudden went from in person to remote working and the challenges that they faced. And a couple of my clients that I deal with on a regular basis had to navigate through this as well. The communications challenges were real, and there was no playbook for it.
It was an extraordinary time, no question about it. I think after the shock maybe of the first, 6, 8 weeks, kind of, I wouldn't say wore off, but maybe died down. That's when it got very real, because those first 6, 8 weeks, it was very much people just were facing total uncertainty. They were struggling with almost the chaos that had been created, right? Does my home work situation even support my ability to work fully? Do I have the right technology? Companies were just dealing with like the kind of battening down the hatches of make it possible for us to survive this piece of it. But once that had passed, I think it became much more about quality. How can we make sure that we know how to use these technologies and do it well during the workday, frankly, while nearly everyone was juggling some kind of personal home environment challenge that had nothing to do with technology. It had to do with, your 3 kids down the hallway who were doing homeschooling at the same time that you were trying to go to work. You and maybe your spouse or your partner were working in shifts, having to work during the nights or the mornings just so that you had coverage, for all of that, or whatever your challenge was. Maybe it was you were in a home with multiple generations of your family who were all trying to weather this storm. So everybody faced challenges like that, and those were ongoing the whole time. But once we got kind of settled a bit, I think then it became much more about preservation of culture and team and effective communications. And those were really, really big issues.
Really big issues, because you think about, and I know that a couple of my clients dealt with this directly. They may have, say, 2 to 500 employees that have all been at the office, and you can always communicate, and you can always call a staff meeting, and you can always get there. And all of a sudden, everybody's remote, and all of a sudden, there's a disconnect there. And you bring up some really interesting points about the sort of personal side of it, the human side of it that goes beyond the work. And it's hard to think back about 14 months and say, this is what we were dealing with. And we had never had to deal with this before in the history of working in America. And now here we were having to deal with it. How do you put together those best communication practices? And I felt like, from my standpoint, helping some of these clients navigate through that constant communications, whether it be email. I also happen to like video. I thought that was a good technique for them to use, because sometimes you want to see the boss, him or her, and those sorts of things work. But there's also a factor here of, once you got over the initial shock, once IT could get their arms around this technical challenge that had been presented to them about how do I get my workers to work effectively in a remote environment at their house, and we don't have, we have the firewall at work, but all of a sudden people are at their own homes with their own Wi-Fi and things like that. Once they got through that, then there's also an issue here, I think, of trust. Is there not? Like, As a boss, you have to trust that your employees, even though you can't see them and you can't walk by their office, you trust that they are doing right by the company. And I know that's a big issue as well.
Absolutely. Trust was central to everything in this entire pandemic time. There's no doubt about it, but in particular, when it comes to employers and employees and their relationships, right? I've always had a remote workforce at our firm. So this really was not something new to us. We've been remote for nearly 18 years in one form or another, with all of our people working either from home environments or other non-office, central office environments. So this wasn't a new thing for me, but even with that history and that experience, we were still presented with lots and lots of new challenges. I had to trust that it was the right thing to do to give a lot of our folks almost larger agency than they'd had even in the past. Sometimes it was clear that someone needed a break, that they needed to take a mental health day. They needed some help and support in putting in better boundaries so that work days didn't bleed one right into the next, which is what was happening. It was really unprecedented when you no longer were either leaving your house or the people you worked with as clients weren't commuting. Everybody started to have these longer work days, and frankly, because there was nothing else to do, right?
Yeah, you get rid of that commute, and I had a lot of people say I'm far more efficient now because I just got rid of at least in some cases 2 hours of commuting each day.
Yeah, no doubt about it. So let's talk about that for a second. The commute part is really interesting because that's been a selling point for me to attract talent to the Harbinger Group for a long time. We don't have any commute, and we really discourage any kind of commute. We have always felt that uptime, efficient work time is what is most valuable, and that's what our clients want from us, right? I think as a consulting entity, that's very, very true. Clients don't want to hear that you're wasting time getting to a space, you're spending the time on their business. So it's always been a big selling point for us in attracting talent. What I saw was clients experiencing that for the first time and appreciating the difference, the calmness that it brought in some ways, the slowing down of their lives, the observations they were making just about people and things happening in the world, nature, all of it. Their brains were slowed down because of the removal of that. It's almost a chaotic and numbing experience, a commute, I believe. So I don't think there's a sense of value in it. And there's a lot of value in saving the time and the money that's associated with commuting, right? So that's a big upside, no doubt about it.
No, it really is, and it's really important to talk about too because there's a couple things at play here also, and I'd heard anecdotally about some managers at some companies that would be on a DM and like every 15 minutes they check in with their employees. Okay, what are you doing now? What are you doing now? Which I think runs counter to being efficient and effective. But that's what micromanagers do sometimes. So depending on who your manager was, who your boss is,
Mhm.
you could have had a really good experience where you did have some latitude to work when it was time to work hard, but also, as you pointed out earlier, you have a different rhythm because you have family at home and you have other responsibilities, people, kids that are going to school in your house and you're working in your house.
Yeah.
But for people that had to have this boss that was always on them and on them and on them, what are you doing now? And are you in front of your computer and this and that? I would think that would have added to the stress of already working at home during a pandemic, but you're trying to be efficient. And it's hard to be efficient when you're talking to your boss every 15 or 30 minutes. Yeah, okay, here I am, I'm in front. Okay, I did this, I did that. That kind of runs counter to that a little bit. And I think that as when we're talking about trust here, Eileen,
Mhm.
we want to make sure that people understand, as a boss, you have to have that trust in your employees that the normal workflow that people would normally have was going to be changed. It just had to be because there's so many people in your house, in your new office. There's so many people coming in and out, or pets, or this or that, and that was a real challenge, and has been a real challenge.
No doubt. Yeah, that's a great point about the over checking on your employees. That doesn't do anybody any good, no doubt about it. And that just makes people feel like they are not trustworthy, right? And I hate that kind of management style myself. Like I said, agency is a big part of what we give here because I just believe fundamentally that people are always at their best and most creative and most productive when they feel supported and trusted. That's just, what I think. And I think that's true. We see that played out in countless scenarios in our world. But we did have to adjust our communications too. I mean, I'll be really honest, even though we were accustomed to living and working rather remote style, and that's different, up until this past year, that wasn't something that a lot of companies did. We still experienced a need to increase our communications across our team in different ways. So like we found what helped was coming together at a consistent time as an entire team, at least weekly, with a clear agenda, partially, but then also just to see each other and allow for moments of connection and humanity. There was something about this past year plus that created isolation, because we couldn't go to the places we were accustomed to going, whether it was the office or elsewhere, to experience interaction in real life with human beings. We couldn't do that. And I saw that taking a toll on the people who just worked at our firm. So we instituted these weekly huddles on video that previously maybe were shorter and maybe only happened every 2 weeks. But when we instituted that and came together as a team, intentionally had those like down conversations. They were not client work focused, but just people focused about ourselves and how we were feeling. I noticed a big difference. And in lowering of stress levels, people being more productive, working better together, lots of things came out of that. And that was a key learning that was beneficial during that time. That's something that we plan to preserve and carry over into the now times, right? Even though we may not need it in the same way, and maybe those meetings will be a little shorter. But I think a lot of companies had to seek interactions that were far less work focused and much more humanity focused as a result of this, isolation period. And I'll be interested to see how that impacts things moving forward, whether you're fully back in the office or a hybrid situation, at your employer. That's something I'm really interested in seeing what happens.
You brought up an interesting point, Eileen, about having those frequent communications with your employees. And I want to take people, but we're going backward here only to get to current events and then to be forward thinking here, just to remind people of what we've been through in the last 12 to 14 months as it relates to remote working and that relationship that you have with the employee employer. But what I found interesting, the Edelman Trust Barometer comes out all the time. They have a trust barometer for every year, and they put one out particularly just for COVID about a year ago, a little over a year ago. And what was interesting was if you think historically about who you trust as an information source in the history of work, you wouldn't always say, I trust my employer the most to give me credible information. However, because of this unprecedented time, because of this remote work situation that happened en masse, some people do it. You talked about your office, you do it all the time, but there are a lot of places that had never done this before. And the Edelman Trust Barometer showed that employer communications, be it email, any of the platforms that you might use, was the most trusted source of information for employees. And that really speaks volumes, doesn't it? Because I think historically you might say, "Oh, I don't always believe what my employer is telling me because they're going to spin it, for their own benefit." But in this particular instance, that was the most trusted source of information.
And you have to ask the question why, right?
Hmm.
Some of the things that I observed um, working with clients across a number of industries was a marked increase in volume and type of communications. So they were the really, really good employers were not only sharing information about how work was evolving at their company, but they were sharing information about what's happening with the virus in their region and nationally. They were sharing best practices to keep their employees healthy. They were sharing everything that they got from the CDC and other sources on a regular basis so that they were almost taking care of them in addition to employing them. And that was a really big shift. And I mean, my theory is that that contributed to people feeling a sense of trust from their employer.
I think you may be right there. So you're listening to the Can You Hear Me podcast. This is Rob Johnson and Eileen Rochford, two self-described communications experts. And I want to transition now, Eileen, and talk about current events and where we kind of gave context about where we were a year or 14 months ago. Now I want to talk about where we are now as we're hopefully coming out of this pandemic. And there's a lot to talk about here. There is, vaccinations are readily available for people that want to take them. And vaccines may be the key to returning to office. Lots of changes. Some of our institutions that we like to go to, whether it's the ballpark or whether it's a concert or the restaurants are reopening. They're reopening now in Illinois on May 14th. It became the bridge phase where you're opening in greater numbers, and then phase 5 starts June 11th, where they're really going to be opening things up if in the event there are no setbacks. So things that people have been clamoring for, things that people have been wanting to happen, are going to start happening. Your fairs, your concerts, your festivals, just getting out, enjoying the summer. There's never a better time in Chicago, as we know, than the summertime. And hopefully all those things are going to align. But in that, the companies are going to be reopening their offices, and there is a lot of talk about how that's going to happen, how that's going to be executed successfully. And we know that there are different companies are doing things in different ways, aren't they?
Yeah, there's a lot of shapes and sizes out there. Every day, I feel like when I'm on LinkedIn or various news sources, we see another major company talking about their plans to reopen, and it ranges. Like Twitter sticking to 100% remote. Google, while initially everybody back in the office was their approach, they had some big backlash, which forced them to reconsider. We've got their new approach. Looks like it's going to settle on 20% remote, but up to 20% of the workforce can be remote. But they have to apply to be allowed to be remote, which is interesting. Goldman Sachs, massive employer in the finance sector, everybody's back in the office on June 1st, no question about it. That's just what's happening, right? So those are three very different scenarios, but they pretty much capture everything that we're hearing. And I'm just so curious how this is all going to play out, mostly because there's so much value in what we all learned, right, over this past year plus in how to effectively work in a remote or a hybrid situation. And it just seems to me, someone who maybe I'm very biased because I've run a remote firm for 18 years. I just don't know why we would be forcing a return to what everybody's calling the before times, just because that's how it was. You know what I'm saying? It's like kind of feels to me like a little too much control, a desire for control from employers to some degree when they're asking for the full return to office, when we've seen so much value come out of not having to do all the things associated with in-office work and being just as effective out of office in a lot of ways.
And I think, from a human nature perspective, Eileen, people like, I think listen, we're social animals, right? We want to be around people. We want to engage with people. I think having to do remote presentation training, as I did for a lot of my clients, how do you break through on a Zoom platform or a WebEx or whatever the case may be? I think people are relishing being back in person. However, I do think people said, hey, I was pretty efficient having some flexibility here, not having to show up at the same place at the same time every day, looking the exact same way and doing the exact same thing. I think once people realized they had that variety, I'm not suggesting that everybody wants to work in their pajamas, but they realized on days that I worked in my pajamas at home, I could still be efficient.
No question about it. I mean, I had an experience just with one of my neighbors yesterday morning. He has never had a commute in 25 years. He's a partner in a law firm, and is self-proclaimed convert to the idea of effective remote working. And he struggled with it, in the first, as he reported to me, in the first 3-4 months, mightily struggled with the technology platforms. He struggled with isolation. He struggled with accessing documents that he needed, some basic stuff. But once he got over that, he realized I don't feel as stressed anymore having to rush out the door, all the things associated with the commute, whether it's um, biking to work, using mass transit or driving. There's stress involved with all of it, any type. And the hours you get back in the day, he shared, he felt that he could do so much more for personal things. Like he said, hey, I took up yoga. I've never really done that on a consistent basis before, but I'm doing it 3 days a week and I feel great. That kind of thing. I know, Rob, you've heard lots of examples like that too, either from clients
Oh
or
my, there's no doubt about it because you have this extra time to be efficient. You're not hopping on a plane. You're not getting in a car. You're not having to do that commute. You're not having to fly to somewhere else. And all of a sudden you have this extra time and so I've had people, one guy in particular that runs a home office who's on the road all the time.
Mm.
He's said he had time to build in for networking and other things that executives don't normally have time for. And he said, hey, I've got an extra 2 hours a day. I got an hour to go meet people and to, collaborate and see what's going on. And I just thought that was really interesting because I was thinking this person is the least flexible person that I know, and yet he was reporting to me that, yeah, I'm really busy, but I control my environment. And because I control my environment, I can decide how I want to allocate the hours that I have to spend on various things. And so that was really interesting to me.
It is. I share a lot of what that he concluded in his own experience. That's exactly what I have found so valuable. Just working remotely for nearly 2 decades. That's shocking to me, but for real, I can keep a consistent take care of me schedule. Um, that would have been almost impossible where working inside of a very large marketing agency at the pace that they operate and having to commute downtown. But no, I really see that there's a lot of value in carving out time for yourself, for your health, whether it's exercise or yoga, Pilates, whatever you need time for to make yourself feel good and stay healthy. It's a lot easier to do that when you don't have a commute stacked up on top of everything else. Yeah, there's no question about it.
But nevertheless, for most people, and I know that you're going to continue your remote work environment because that's worked for you for, as you pointed out, almost 2 decades.
Mm.
A lot of people are going to be returning to office. And we talked about trust earlier, Eileen, as it related to trusting your employees during the pandemic to to be professionals and to get the work done, even even with all the other challenges that were presented them at their home office. But now I want to talk about trust a little bit as it relates to the return to office scenario
Mhm.
and and how people are going to be able to manage um, what they've experienced in the last year and then weave it back with okay, return to normal. I don't think there's such a thing. I don't think anything's going to return to normal because the experience that we just had as a society for the past 12 to 14 months has been something we will never forget.
Mhm.
Nevertheless, some people may not want to return to the office. Some people may want to. I mean, there's a lot of different things at play here. And now we're talking about trust as it relates to the return to office scenario for a lot of people.
Absolutely. They're very real and critical questions. I think employers need to be asking and digging into well beyond, their executive leadership team as they tackle the question of um, how to return, not just when to return. And that the questions they need to be asking aren't just of themselves. They have to be asking them of their own employees. I mean, I think from a communications perspective, the most important thing that companies and executives can do right now as they sort this out is gather as much direct input from across a variety, if not all, of their employees and staff and contractors to find out what's most important to them and get at the heart of, okay, what can we retain that was good from this past year? And what do we need to go back to now that we don't have to operate in that manner anymore, right? If they get They need to get the input directly from the folks who work for the companies, in my opinion, and then factor that in at a very high level in their decision making and planning processes. I think there's some really interesting research that point to the tensions that are presented here, right? There's research from
Yes.
PwC, right?
And
PwC
these
said
numbers are really interesting, by the way.
it is. So 55% of employees PwC surveyed want to work remotely at least 3 days a week. They want to work remotely at least 3 days a week. Yet 60%, 68% of their executives want employees in the office at least 3 days a week. So right there, you just see it already. They're kind of at odds in terms of how much employees want to stay home and work remotely, and how much executives want their folks in their office working in person. So there's that. Live careers research showed that a third of workers reported they would quit and find another job before going full time in an office again. And I got to tell you, when I'm on LinkedIn I'm a marketing communications professional, it's a place and we primarily represent B2B companies. I'm in there a lot, and the amount of job postings that are going on is, it's very, very hard to even find talent right now. It's it's shocking to me how many of them have remote or all remote right in the heading, right
I've
there.
seen them. I've seen them. It's unbelievable that's a carrot.
It is.
People are thinking, hey, people want to work remotely, and the way that these jobs are posted on LinkedIn, for instance, that you were referencing, is unbelievable, because there's so many of them that are like remote work, and they know that that is a carrot. They know that that is an attractive quality that people want to be able to employ if they so choose.
So employers can't put the genie back in the bottle, right? They just can't. Not wholly. And to think that they can will create giant fissures in the relationships with their employees, in my opinion,
Hmm.
as a communications person. It's bound to. Think about the fact that for this entire time, employers had to cede so much, again, agency to employees to get the job done. And those employees rose to the occasion. They did
Yeah.
it. They
Yes, they did.
delivered, right? In sectors all over, in regions all over the world. They delivered. So to then go back, literally go back, is is uh, is a bad choice. Employers just really have to think about, what can I keep that allowed greater flexibility, was a plus in the minds of my employees. What can I keep so that I give them more time back? Because if you're going to ask them to give up something like no commute, you're going to have to give them something back.
Hmm.
That just makes perfect sense, doesn't it?
Well, I think you're really raising some interesting points here, Eileen, because you're talking about the change in communications that needs to occur, and as you were saying it, as you were talking about the PwC research about the 55% of employees want to work remotely at least 3 days a week, but 68% of executives want employees in the office. So there's the tension that you're talking about. But when you're talking about the messaging, the question is, who's doing the messaging? Is the messaging being done by the employer, who's going to sit there and tell you all the great reasons that you need to be back in the office at least 3 days a week? Or is it the 55% of employees who might say, gosh, if I'm not in the office all the time, you can maybe get a smaller office space and save on rent, because obviously a lot of businesses were hit hard by the pandemic and cost savings is a huge issue. So the question is, who's doing the messaging? How do you make your case for that? But what you're really talking about here is a change from sort of the top-down management style that exists in a lot of places and has historically. And all of a sudden, as it relates to this particular issue, you're talking about a little bit more collaborative approach to problem solving, and to thinking about what your new office life, if you have one, return to office, is going to look like.
Mhm. You have to appreciate that employers made massive adaptations in so many unique and interesting and unprecedented ways, so that people could remain employed and remain effective. And there were elements of humanity that we shared with each other as coworkers that we never shared before. There's just an intimacy in these relationships that's totally new. So to just shut the steel door on all that and expect everyone to go back to the way it was with this, as you put it, top down or ivory tower decision making model, that will absolutely backfire. There's no doubt about it. And when you look at the fact that in this environment right now, companies are hiring like crazy. It's amazing to me. I just didn't think that that's what this was going to be. But talent is on the market, and you can get more, you can get better. It's not that hard, right? So people have options. If you want them to stay, you have to keep that trusting relationship. And what that looks like is demonstrating that their input matters, that their needs matter. You're not able to do everything that they want. No employer ever is. But demonstrating that you heard them and you took into account their exact needs, their special needs, their requirements that have changed, and you tried to figure out a way to adapt and so that you could keep that. That says a lot. That retains trust. But again, I'm going to say it. If you take something away, expect them to give something up rather, which they feel is being taken away, then you really do have to give something in return. And I think the Google example is a good one. They were pretty adamant, everybody back in. And when they saw what that created amongst their employees and that backlash, the adaptation that they made to the 20% get to work remotely, or up to 20%, and you have to apply. I mean, it's weird, some of the constraints they put around that, but still, that was done because they realized they couldn't just slam that steel door again. And when they tried to, it backfired.
And I think as you referenced the Google situation, that was not getting the buy-in from everybody. It blew up in their face, for lack of a better term, and it was such a key issue. It's the return to office. We've been working remotely for the most part, and now we're going to return to the office. And you're talking about having a collaborative approach where people's input matters. And I think that you're absolutely correct in that, because if you don't get buy-in on this issue, you're going to have anarchy, or you're going to have pushback, or you're going to have something that you're not going to like as a boss, as an employer. And so it's very important to understand that. But I think it also raises a very legitimate question, Eileen, which is, if I'm an employer and I understand that my management style maybe needs to change a little bit as it relates to this return to office scenario, and I make sure that I have the proper buy-in from everybody and that their voices are being heard and their input is being valued, is that going to extend beyond the return to office? Is it going to extend to other parts of the business? In other words, you're the boss. You make the tough calls. That's you own your firm, and you have that right to do that. But will this return to office collaboration, and this has to be collaborative, because you want everybody to feel like they're being heard and their opinion matters.
Mhm.
Will it extend in the future to other things? Will they expect that, well, the boss, I'm not saying it's a democracy in the workplace, but is it going to change? Is that going to change maybe some of the management styles if this big issue, an issue of great import like this,
Mhm.
is going to um, have the feedback from the employees in the manner that it will? Will this extend to other things? I know that's a little bit of a crystal ball thing, but I
Mhm.
think it raises an interesting issue.
It definitely does. It, so obviously, I'm an employer, not of a huge company by any stretch. It's very, very small. Um, but I've always believed that you get the best out of people when you give them a whole lot of input and flexibility. They're at their best in those environments. Um, and at the same time, there is a need for structure and policies. You have to have them, right? There just has to be. It's partially driven by law, partially driven by just human beings and how we think and operate. You've got to have it, for order and other things. If companies don't recognize that the impact of this past year plus as is I won't say flattening, but almost to a degree, some democratization of the relationship between employer and employee, I think they're kidding themselves. I really do. I think things changed dramatically, and the appreciation for how serious and significant that change is needs to be present in the decision making of whether it's return to work or what are our flexible work policies moving forward, our compensation policies, our approach to everything from spot bonuses to mental health days. There's a massive democratization that has taken place, and it's in very small ways, but when you add them all up, it's big. That's my opinion.
It is, and I think that your awareness of this as an employer is tremendous, because I have to think that other employers are thinking the same thing. And as we transition beyond just the return to office scenario and the collaboration that will need to take place, but also as you talk about having a little bit more democratization of the process in the office, I also think about the millennials are making up such a huge portion of the workforce, and in the next 10 years it's only going to get even more so. And as you know, employing some of them, that they march to the beat of a little bit of a different drummer. They have always embraced a little bit more remote working style in general before the pandemic, and now as the pandemic has hit us and as we're coming out of it, hopefully, that that's even more of an emphasis for people who are workers of that age. But for you as a boss, it also speaks to something else, which is retention. It's keeping talent around. It's, what do I have to do as an employer? I don't want to have turnover. I don't want to have to, retrain people or train people again and again and again. I want to keep my good people. So there's also that pressure, understanding that we went through a pandemic and understanding that this is a little bit different day and age now. And I would suggest that the bosses that figure that out sooner rather than later are going to have greater success.
Absolutely. It's another thing. Another aspect of this I'll say though is talent. This topic of keeping talent,
Hmm.
very, very valid. It's also about acquisition of
Oh,
talent now, right?
acquisition and retention. I mean, that's key.
There's no border to where you can get folks who are the right people anymore. We've proven that. The best talent can be part of your team no matter where they're located, as long as you're open to remote working. And if you're
Mhm.
not, then you're cutting yourself off from that. It's very, very limited if it's only people from within your region. So, another thing for folks to think about. There's a,
So
there's a, a whole new world that's been opened up.
no, there has been, and I'm just curious to know, as an employer, the personal and professional journey that you have to go on, because some people are all bosses are different. Some are like you, who are trying to empower and challenge their workers to be their very best, but also giving them some latitude and some freedom. And then you have, as I mentioned earlier, you have the micromanagers. But then you have other people that may not be micromanagers, but that are stuck in their old ways of, here's how work gets done at its best, and it's in the office, and we're rolling up our sleeves, and we're in that conference room, all day long. And for those people, their their attitudes, the way they conduct business, might have to shift a little.
I totally agree with that. I've personally seen it. We have multiple clients who were in the office, you know, formal professional dressed environments, in finance and banking and venture capital environments that because they had to change, they changed. And all of a sudden, they've seen, oh, it works. It actually works. And it was good for us. And we not only survived in a lot of ways, being tested by fire, they forged deeper, better, more meaningful relationships with their employees and with the organizations they serve in ways that I don't think they ever could have had we not gone through what we all went through together. In their industries, even it was amazing to see how they could shift. And my hope is that they will retain that open-mindedness that they were, let's say it, we were forced to do it. None of us had a choice. We had to. And that may not have felt very good. But retaining the open-mindedness aspect of the experience as we kind of evolve into the next chapter, I'd like to see as much of that as possible, because I mean, we're in this incredible time of advancement technologically. Gosh, we got a vaccine to market in record time, and thank goodness that we
And months
were able to
and
do that.
months. Yeah.
Absolutely. But this time that we're all living in right now, it also presents some true terrifying challenges and so many different levels, right? Well, let's just keep the open-mindedness. Let's not dig in our heels and force ourselves to return to the how it was, right? I
I
want
think
to.
that's
It's
I
so
think
much.
it's impossible.
I feel that comes from a place of control. I really do, and that's a shortcoming.
Oh, it is. It
It's so
is.
limiting to do that.
And you can see it, and I think that the people that are trying to be controlling, the people that are stuck in their old ways, because the world changed so dramatically, and even though we're going to return to some sort of normalcy, whatever that means, it still will never be the same. And I like what you were talking about, being a veteran employer, and understanding, okay, we were forced to do this, but I also learned a few things, and I actually maybe changed the way that I want to conduct my business. And I'm thinking about one of my clients in particular, a mid cap financial services firm here in Chicago that has very veteran leadership, people that have been around for 40 plus years, who were forced to do the same things all employers were, but embraced a constant communication strategy, knew that the words that were coming out of his mouth and the mouths of the other C suite level executives, people were hanging on every word. Getting back to the COVID Edelman Trust Barometer. Who do you trust? My employer right now. Everything that they said, people were, and I would tell them this, they're listening to every word you're saying. They're watching every move you make. So whether you're on a Zoom call or whether you're, sending an email, whatever the case is, the scrutiny and the detail that the attention they're paying to what you're saying has never been greater. And I think that was a shift change for some of them, because sometimes as the boss, you say something and you're like, how many people heard that? And in this particular instance, everybody was hearing that. And you have to understand that moving forward, because you had that experience, there's greater responsibility for you as a boss.
Definitely. Also, think about the equity of that trust that they're now placing in you. How valuable that is. Why would you want to squander that by not factoring in their preferences, their input on how this should go, the evolution of the return to work? Why would you want to squander that? That's crazy. That's something that nobody should give away. You want to keep retaining that trust, retaining those people, making them feel empowered, supported as much as you possibly can. Again, in my opinion, but I mean, I really believe that that's something that employers would be nuts to throw away.
Well, your opinion's very important here because it's your podcast. So, yeah, whatever you think, we're listening to, because it's valid. And I really like the point you just made about the equity and about the trust and about why would you want to give that up? You've spent all this time and effort changing the culture because you were forced to. So what if now you can change the culture because it's the right thing to do?
Mhm. While capitalizing on all the learnings. There tremendous learnings took place, whether it was technology based seen clients adapt to project management systems and had never touched those kinds of things before, and saw them thrive as a team, become super productive because they had to embrace something they'd never even known existed before. All of the learnings, all of the good. I mean, I would encourage other business owners to catalog that, take serious note of the impact that those great things have made on their business, and plan for how to keep them, incorporate them. Don't go back to the way that you were communicating via email and maybe instant messenger inside your office. Stay on the platforms where there's true collaboration and project management, and productivity occurring. Keep it. Keep all the good stuff. Keep all the
Absolutely.
frequency of meetings, the over communication, but just do it about the things that now matter. So it's an evolution, right? But not tossing it all out. I just would caution certainly any client not to do that. And we learn things here at the Harbinger Group, working in concert with clients in a way that we hadn't before because they were forced to adapt. We're not throwing any of that out. We're keeping all of it and we're going to build on it.
Smart. That's why you're the boss, because you get that. Well, listen, Eileen, this has been great fun. For those of you that are tuning in, we appreciate it more than you know. You're listening to the Can You Hear Me podcast with Rob Johnson and Eileen Rochford, talking about all things important as it relates to communication. And the next time on the Can You Hear Me podcast, we're going to talk about the erosion of trust in our institutions. We're talking about social institutions like government, business, non-governmental organization, NGOs, and of course, the media. That's the next time on Can You Hear Me, the podcast with Rob Johnson and Eileen Rochford. Eileen, great job, and thanks for the expertise.
Thank you. Always great to be with you. Can't wait for the next episode.
Yes. And be sure to tune into the next episode. And we hope you enjoyed the information today. And please give us your feedback on social media or wherever else you have found this podcast. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you again next time.
Bye, everybody.